My brother-in-law just told my wife he is in love with her. I had always trusted my brother Daniel. He was my best man at our wedding, the fun uncle to our kids, and the one person I could confide in when life got rough. But trust is a delicate thing, one that shatters irreparably when betrayed. It started with a single moment, a lingering glance, a pause too long in a conversation between him and my wife, Julia. At first, I thought nothing of it. But then came the tension, the stolen whispers when they thought I wasn't looking, the slight shift in her behavior. Then, one evening, everything unraveled. Daniel came over for dinner. The air was thick with something I couldn't quite name, but I knew something was wrong. Julia barely met my eyes. Daniel seemed restless, drinking more than usual. When dinner was over, I stepped outside for a moment, and when I returned, I heard him say it. "I love you, Julia." The words rang in my ears like gunshots. I froze just outside the kitchen doorway, my pulse hammering in my chest. "I've always loved you," he continued, his voice trembling, "even before you married my brother." A long silence. I expected Julia to yell, to reject him outright. Instead, I heard a sigh. Not of annoyance, not of disgust, but something softer. I stepped into the room. "What the hell did you just say?" My voice came out sharper than I intended. Julia's eyes widened in shock. Daniel turned pale. He hadn't expected me to hear. He hesitated. Then, as if deciding there was no point in lying, he met my gaze. "I love her, and I always have." The weight of his confession settled like a storm cloud between us. My hands clenched into fists, my breath ragged. Julia finally found her voice. "Ethan, I swear I didn't what?" I snapped. "Didn't know, didn't suspect, or didn't care." I needed answers. But more than that, I needed the truth. And the truth, I realized, wasn't going to be easy to swallow. My brother-in-law just told my wife. He is in love with her. Part 2. The silence stretched between us like a chasm. I could feel my heartbeat pounding in my ears, my fists clenching at my sides. Daniel, my own brother, had just confessed to loving my wife. And she hadn't immediately pushed him away. I turned to Julia, my voice tight. "Did you know?" She swallowed, her hands gripping the edge of the kitchen counter as if to steady herself. I never encouraged it, Ethan. I swear. That wasn't a... No." I shot a glare at Daniel. "How long?" "Since the beginning," he said, his voice raw. "Since before you even asked her out. I loved her first." Something inside me cracked. "And yet you stood beside me at my wedding, gave a toast about love and loyalty?" "Because I wanted her to be happy," he interrupted, his voice rising. "And she chose you, but that doesn't mean my feelings disappeared." Julia exhaled sharply. "Ethan, I never had feelings for him. I love you, but I should have told you. I suspected he felt this way for a long time. I just didn't know how to say it without making everything worse." "Worse? How could it be worse than this?" I took a slow step back. I needed space to think, to breathe, but a sick feeling gnawed at my gut. Something didn't add up. "Tell me the truth, Julia," I said, my voice dangerously low. "Has anything ever happened between you two?" "No," she said quickly, too quickly. I turned my gaze to Daniel. He hesitated, and in that hesitation, I saw it. A flicker of something. Guilt? Regret? My stomach twisted. "Did something happen?" Daniel closed his eyes. "No, not like that." "What the hell does that mean?" My voice turned sharp, Julia's face drained of color. "Ethan, please, this isn't what you think." "Then explain it to me." Daniel exhaled, rubbing his hands over his face. There was a moment. His voice was barely above a whisper. "One night. A mistake. But nothing happened. We stopped before I lunged before I even realized what I was doing. My fist connected with his jaw, sending him stumbling back into the counter. Julia screamed my name as I grabbed him by the collar. "You son of a... Ethan, stop!" Julia pushed between us, her hands on my chest, her eyes filled with desperation. "Please, just listen!" I was breathing hard, my vision red with fury. "When?" Daniel wiped his mouth, wincing. 2 years ago? 2 years. 2 years I had been living in ignorance. Julia's voice cracked. "Ethan, I swear, nothing happened. It was after a fight you and I had. I was upset. I went for a walk and I ran into Daniel. We talked, we had a few drinks, and..." She broke off, looking down. "He kissed me." I felt the world tilt beneath me. "You kissed him back?" My voice came out hoarse. Tears welled in her eyes. "For a second. And then I stopped it. I told him it was a mistake. I walked away. And I never let it happen again." I stared. At her, then at Daniel, who couldn't even meet my eyes. My hands trembled with the weight of what I had just learned. 2 years. 2 damn years. And you never told me. Julia let out a soft sob. "I didn't want to lose you." My laugh was bitter. "And yet here we are. Would you like Ethan to investigate further, suspecting there's more to the story? Or should we focus on his emotional turmoil and decision-making, whether he can forgive or if this is the breaking point of his marriage? My brother-in-law just told my wife he is in love with her, Part 3. I stood there, staring at Julia as if she were a stranger. 2 years. 2 years of deception, of silence, of pretending. My mind raced, grasping at every late night she had spent away. Every time Daniel had looked at her just a second too long. "You should have told me," I said, my voice eerily calm. Julia wiped her tears. "I was afraid, Ethan. Afraid of losing you. Afraid of what it would do to us. I didn't want it to mean anything. But it did mean something." My gaze flicked to Daniel, who still hadn't moved. "And you sat across from me at every family dinner pretending nothing happened?" He swallowed hard. I was ashamed. I tried to bury it. "You had 2 years to tell me the truth," I said coldly. "And instead you waited until tonight to confess your love to my wife while I was in the other damn room?" Daniel's face tightened, but he didn't answer. A sick feeling curled in my gut. Something wasn't adding up. "Why tonight, Daniel?" I took a step closer, my voice low and dangerous. "Why now?" Julia turned to him, realization dawning on her face. "Oh my God, you weren't just confessing. You thought something had changed. Didn't you?" Daniel looked away. My pulse pounded. "Answer her." He hesitated, then sighed. I thought she was finally going to leave you." A cold chill shot down my spine. Julia gasped. "What?" Daniel ran a hand through his hair. "I thought you were unhappy. I thought you might finally realize that..." "That what?" I stepped closer, my fists itching. "That you were the better choice?" Daniel's jaw clenched. "I love her, Ethan. I always have. I thought she might feel the same way." Julia shook her head in disbelief. "Daniel, I have never given you a reason to think that." I exhaled sharply, my mind spinning. Something still wasn't right. "What made you think she was going to leave me?" Daniel's face darkened, and then it hit me. "Someone told you something." I narrowed my eyes. "Who?" Daniel's throat bobbed. Julia turned to me, panic flashing in her eyes. "Ethan, what are you saying?" "I'm saying," I bit out, "that Daniel wouldn't just confess out of nowhere. Someone made him think you were leaving me. And I want to know, who?" Daniel's lips pressed together. "Damn it, Daniel!" I shoved him against the counter. "Tell me!" His eyes darted to Julia. "Ask your wife!" Silence. Julia's face drained of color. What? You were talking to someone, weren't you? Daniel's voice was hoarse. You told someone you were unhappy, that you were considering leaving. I thought it meant I had a chance. I turned to her. My own wife. Is that true? She hesitated, and in that hesitation I found my answer. My brother-in-law just told my wife he is in love with her. Part 4. The room was suffocating. My pulse throbbed in my ears, my breath shallow. Julia's hesitation wasn't just hesitation, it was guilt. You were talking to someone, I repeated. My voice eerily steady. Who was it, Julia? Her lips parted, but no words came out. She looked trapped, like a deer caught in headlights. Daniel scoffed bitterly. Go on, Julia, tell him. I turned back to him. If you know so damn much, then say it yourself. Daniel hesitated, his jaw tight. I don't know exactly who, but someone told me she was thinking about leaving you. Someone close to her. I only put my hopes on the line because I thought... He stopped, shaking his head. It doesn't matter now. I exhaled sharply. I could feel the storm inside me building, twisting, searching for an outlet. Julia, I said again, my patience razor thin. Who did you talk to? She closed her eyes, as if summoning the courage to speak. Then, barely above a whisper, she said it. It was... your sister. For a moment I couldn't process what I had just heard. Lena? She nodded. I never said I was leaving you, Ethan. I swear. But I confided in her, about the arguments we've had, about how things felt different lately. I didn't think she would... I didn't know she would tell Daniel. My mind reeled. Lena, my own sister. It felt like a betrayal on top of a betrayal. What exactly did you tell her? My voice was dangerously calm. Julia swallowed hard. I told her I felt lost, that our marriage had changed, and I wasn't sure if we were happy anymore. I never said I wanted to leave, but I guess she read between the lines. Daniel let out a bitter laugh. Of course she did. Because the truth is, Julia, deep down, you were thinking about it, weren't you? No, she snapped. I was venting. I didn't mean... I held up a hand, cutting her off. I need to talk to Lena. Julia's eyes widened. Ethan, please. She didn't mean any harm. I ignored her, grabbing my phone and dialing my sister's number. My hands were steady, but inside, I was a storm. It rang twice before she picked up. Ethan? We need to talk. Silence. Then a hesitant, what's wrong? Don't play dumb, Lena. I know you told Daniel that Julia was thinking of leaving me. A sharp inhale on the other end, then a pause. Ethan. I was just trying to help. A bitter laugh escaped me. Help? You just handed my wife's doubts to the one person who has been in love with her for years? Lena sighed. I didn't think he would act on it like this. Then what the hell were you thinking? I was thinking, she said slowly, that maybe you needed a wake-up call. My grip on the phone tightened. What the hell does that mean? It means you and Julia have been falling apart, Ethan, and neither of you were doing anything about it. Clenched my jaw. That wasn't your decision to make. Lena sighed again. Maybe not, but Julia was unhappy, and she was afraid to tell you. And Daniel, he's been drowning in this for years. I thought if the truth came out, maybe things would finally come to a head. I closed my eyes, breathing deeply. Well, congratulations, Lena. You got what you wanted, and now I have to pick up the pieces. Another silence, then, softer. I'm sorry, Ethan. I hung up. Julia was watching me, her arms wrapped around herself. What did she say? I let out a bitter chuckle. That this was all some twisted intervention? Daniel scoffed. Great. So what now? I turned to him, my anger still, simmering. Now? You get the hell out of my house. He hesitated, his expression conflicted, but he knew better than to argue. He grabbed his coat, glancing at Julia one last time before walking out the door. The silence left in his wake was suffocating. Turned back to Julia. "We need to talk," I said. She nodded, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I know." And just like that, the real battle began. My brother-in-law just told my wife he is in love with her. Part 5. The air between us felt electric, charged with tension that neither of us knew how to diffuse. Julia stood there, arms wrapped around herself, her eyes flickering with exhaustion. Regret and something else. Something I couldn't quite name. "Say something," she whispered. I exhaled slowly, running a hand through my hair. "Where do I even start, Julia?" She swallowed hard. "I didn't lie to you, Ethan. I never cheated. I never encouraged Daniel, I swear. But you confided in my sister. About me, about our marriage, and in doing that, you gave Daniel hope. You don't think that's betrayal in its own way?" I flinched. "I didn't mean for this to happen." "That's the problem," I muttered. "It did happen, and now I don't know what's worse. Daniel telling you he's in love with you, or the fact that you were talking to my own sister about doubts you never shared with me." Julia wiped her eyes. "I was afraid, Ethan. I didn't want to hurt you. And yet, here we are." Silence. I stared at her, searching for the woman I married, the woman I had built a life with. But for the first time, I wasn't sure if she was still there. "So tell me the truth now, Julia. Are you unhappy?" Her breath hitched. I don't know." My stomach clenched. "That's not an answer." She looked at me then, really looked at me. "Ethan, I love you, but somewhere along the way, I started feeling like we were going through the motions. I tried to push it down, but it was there, and I thought if I just ignored it, it would go away. But it didn't." I felt a sharp pang in my chest. "So instead of talking to me, you talked to Lena." I needed someone to listen, someone who wasn't in the middle of it. "And now Daniel thinks you are on the verge of leaving me. Do you get how that looks, Julia?" She let out a shaky breath. "I know how it looks, but it's not what I wanted. I never wanted Daniel to think there was a chance. I never wanted to hurt you like this." I paced the room, my mind whirling. "Did Lena say anything else? Anything to make you think she was pushing for something?" Julia hesitated. "Julia." My voice was sharp. She bit her lip. She kept asking if I was happy, if I ever thought about what my life would be like if I had made a different choice, if I had ended up with someone else." I stopped pacing. "Someone else? Or Daniel?" Julia shook her head quickly. "She never said his name directly, but now, I wonder." A chill ran down my spine. Something about this didn't sit right. What if this wasn't just about Daniel? I muttered. Julia frowned. "What do you mean?" I turned to her, my mind connecting, dots I hadn't seen before. What if Lena didn't just tell Daniel you were unhappy? What if she wanted him to act on it? Julia's face paled. "Ethan, you don't think," I cut in, "that someone wanted this marriage to break apart, and I need to find out why. My brother-in-law just told my wife he is in love with her." Part 6. A sickening realization settled in my gut like a weight. Something about this wasn't adding up. Lena had always been protective of me, or at least that's what I had believed. But now, with Julia's confession, that she had planted doubts, that she had nudged Daniel toward making a move, it felt orchestrated, planned. But why? Julia was staring at me, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "Ethan, what are you thinking?" I met her gaze. "That I need to talk to Lena, alone." Her lips parted as if she wanted to protest, but she didn't. She only nodded, wiping the last remnants of tears from her eyes. "I'll be here when you get back." I grabbed my keys and walked out, my pulse pounding. Lena's apartment was a sleek, minimalist space overlooking the city, a far cry from the cozy chaos of my own home. She answered on the second knock, dressed in yoga pants and a loose sweater, a glass of wine in hand. "Ethan," she greeted smoothly, as if she had been expecting me. "We need to talk." She arched a brow but stepped aside, letting me in. The moment the door shut, I turned to face her. "Why did you tell Daniel that Julia was thinking of leaving me?" Lena took a slow sip of wine before setting the glass down. "Because she was, Ethan. She just didn't have the courage to admit it yet." Anger flared in my chest. "That wasn't your call to make." She tilted her head as if studying me. "Would you rather she kept lying to you?" She wasn't lying. She was confused. "There's a difference." Lena sighed, moving to lean against the counter. "You're angry. I get that. But Ethan, I didn't do this to hurt you. I did it to wake you up." "Bullshit," I snapped. "You knew exactly what you were doing. You wanted this to happen." Her expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. "Why would I want that?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out." I took a step closer. "Did you ever stop to think that maybe Daniel wouldn't just sit on that information? That maybe he would take it as an open door?" Lena let out a soft chuckle. "You give Daniel too much credit. He's not exactly known for his courage. If he finally grew a spine and told Julia how he felt, well, that was his choice. And you just happened to give him the final push?" She shrugged. "I may have suggested that he stop pining and start fighting for what he wants." "But Ethan," she folded her arms, "this isn't about me. This is about you. If your marriage was as strong as you like to believe, none of this would have mattered." I clenched my fists. "You had no right." "I had every right," she countered. "Because I'm your sister, and I see what you refuse to. You've been unhappy too, Ethan. You just won't admit it." My breath came in sharp, uneven bursts. Was that true? Had I been so focused on Julia's betrayal that I hadn't considered my own feelings? No, this wasn't about me. This was about Lena, her interference, her manipulation. "Who else have you been talking to, Lena?" I asked. "Who else have you been pulling the strings with?" Her lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "What are you implying?" A chill ran down my spine. There was something she wasn't telling me, and I was going to find out exactly what it was. Should Ethan dig deeper into Lena's motives? Or should he confront Daniel again, suspecting that there's more to the story than he initially thought? My brother-in-law just told my wife he is in love with her. Part 7. Lena's smile lingered, almost taunting. I could feel it burrowing under my skin like a splinter. "You're not telling me everything," I said slowly, watching for the slightest reaction. She tilted her head, feigning innocence. "And what exactly do you think I'm hiding, Ethan?" I took a step closer. "I think you wanted this marriage to fall apart. I think you pushed Daniel to make his move because you knew it would shake the foundation of everything. And I think you're enjoying watching me scramble for answers." Lena exhaled, shaking her head as if I were some lost cause. "I didn't push Daniel to do anything he didn't already want to do. You should be asking yourself why Julia was so receptive, not why I let the truth slip into the open. Don't turn this around on me." "Why not?" "You're so desperate to blame someone, Ethan. But what if the cracks in your marriage were already there? What if I just helped reveal them?" Her words slithered through my mind like poison. "That's not all you did," she arched an eyebrow. "Oh? You're playing a game, Lena. You always have been." You knew how Daniel felt. You knew Julia was vulnerable, and you knew exactly what would happen if those two things collided. And yet, you still encouraged it. She didn't deny it. "Why?" I pressed. For the first time, Lena hesitated. And that hesitation was everything. You're so sure I'm the villain in this story, Ethan? She let out a soft, humorless laugh. Maybe I just did what needed to be done. For who? I asked, my voice low. Silence. Then she stepped closer, her expression unreadable. You really want the truth? I held her gaze. Try me. She studied me for a long moment before speaking. Fine. You were never supposed to be with Julia. I felt my pulse spike. What the hell does that mean? Lena exhaled, crossing her arms. She was supposed to be with Daniel. Before you. Before everything. They were close. He was in love with her. And then you swooped in, and suddenly he was just the guy standing in your shadow. That was over a decade ago. Feelings like that. Don't just disappear, Ethan. My stomach twisted. So what? You decided to rewrite history? No. I just let things play out the way they should have all those years ago. I stared at her, struggling to process it all. You're lying. Am I? Her voice was barely a whisper. Memories flashed through my mind. Daniel's awkwardness around Julia, the way he never seemed comfortable when she and I were together. Had I really missed it? Or had I just chosen to ignore it? So that's it? I asked bitterly. You just decided to tear my marriage apart because of some twisted sense of fate? Lena's expression softened slightly. I did what I thought was right. I felt a hollow sort of rage fill my chest. And what if I don't let you win? She smiled. Then prove me wrong. My mind was racing as I left Lena's apartment. If what she said was true, if Daniel had always been in love with Julia, then this wasn't just a betrayal. It was a long-buried truth clawing its way to the surface, and that meant I needed to talk to Daniel. Now. My brother-in-law just told my wife he is in love with her. Part 8. The drive to Daniel's apartment felt like a slow descent into something inevitable. My hands gripped the steering wheel, my mind replaying Lena's words over and over. She was supposed to be with Daniel. Could that be true? Had I unknowingly stolen Julia from him all those years ago? Or was this just another one of Lena's manipulations? Half-truths woven together into something that felt like reality. I needed answers. I needed to hear it from Daniel himself. The moment I knocked on his door, I heard movement inside. A hesitation. Then the door opened and Daniel stood there, looking like hell. His eyes were shadowed, his shirt wrinkled like he hadn't slept in days. Ethan. I stepped past him before he could object, locking eyes with him. We need to talk. He shut the door and turned to face me, exhaling sharply. I figured you'd be coming. Did you? My voice was tight. Then tell me, Daniel, how long have you been in love with my wife? A flicker of something crossed his face. Guilt. Resignation. Lena told you? Yeah. And now you're going to tell me the truth. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, looking away. It doesn't matter anymore. It matters to me. He let out a bitter laugh. Of course it does. Now that it's out in the open, now that you feel threatened, suddenly you care. I stepped closer, my voice dangerously low. Don't twist this, Daniel. I need the truth. A long silence stretched between us. Then, finally, he spoke. I loved her first. The words hit me like a punch. Before you. Before everything. I was going to tell her. I was this close to telling her. His hands clenched into fists. And then you came along. And suddenly she only had eyes for you. I swallowed hard, my chest tightening. You never said anything, I muttered. What was I supposed to do? His voice cracked with frustration. You were my brother, Ethan, and she was happy with you. What was I supposed to say? That I was in love with the woman you were about to marry? I stared at him, my mind spinning. So you buried it? I tried to, he admitted. But it never really went away. And when Lena told me Julia was thinking about leaving you, I stiffened. You saw your chance. He hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, I did. A sharp, bitter laugh escaped me. So this whole time, you were just waiting for my marriage to fall apart? No, he said quickly. It wasn't like that. I never wanted to hurt you. But I couldn't just ignore it anymore. When I told Julia how I felt, it wasn't to steal her from you. It was because I had to be honest. For once, I stared at him, trying to process it all. And Julia? I asked finally. What does she want? Daniel's expression darkened. She doesn't know. I blinked. What? She hasn't given me an answer. His jaw clenched. She said she needed time to think. A cold realization settled in my chest. Julia hadn't immediately shut him down. She hadn't immediately chosen me, and that, more than anything, felt like a knife to the gut. I left Daniel's apartment in a daze. Julia needed time to think. What the hell did that mean? Had I already lost her, or was this the moment where I had to fight for my own wife? What should Ethan do next? Confront Julia and demand an answer? Take a step back and investigate Lena's true motives further? Make a move of his own, one that Daniel and Julia wouldn't see coming? My brother-in-law just told my wife he is in love with her. Part 9. I drove aimlessly for an hour, trying to calm the storm in my head. But no matter how many times I played the conversation back, the same gut-wrenching truth remained. Julia hadn't shut him down. She was thinking about it. That single fact burned worse than Daniel's confession. If she loved me, there wouldn't be anything to think about. That's when I realized I couldn't go home. Not yet. If I walked through that door and saw her standing there, I wasn't sure what I'd say. Would I demand an answer? Would I want to hear it? Or would I just break apart in front of her? No, I needed to think, to understand. And there was only one person left who might have the missing pieces. Lena's game Lena was waiting for me. It was almost like she knew I'd come back. She leaned against her kitchen counter, a glass of wine in her hand, watching me with quiet amusement. Twice in one night, she mused. People might start to talk. Cut the crap, Lena. I shut the door behind me, my voice edged with frustration. I need the truth, all of it. She tilted her head, studying me like a puzzle she had already solved. And what truth is that? I stepped forward. Did you push Daniel to confess? A slow smile spread across her lips. He didn't need much of a push. I exhaled sharply. You wanted this to happen, didn't you? You wanted to tear my marriage apart. She sipped her wine, unbothered. I wanted the truth to come out. Isn't that what you always wanted, Ethan? The truth? I clenched my jaw. I don't believe for a second that you did this for my benefit. You're right, she admitted, swirling, the wine in her glass. It wasn't for you. It was for Daniel. Why? I asked, narrowing my eyes. Lena set the glass down and folded her arms. Because he deserved a chance. You never even gave him that. That wasn't my choice to make, wasn't it? She arched an eyebrow. You walked into Julia's life, and suddenly Daniel was nothing more than your best man at the wedding. He spent years pretending to be fine while watching the woman he loved build a life with you. I swallowed hard, but I refused to let her manipulate me. So you decided to fix it? I asked bitterly. By breaking apart my marriage? Lena sighed. Your marriage was already broken, Ethan. I just exposed the cracks. I shook my head. And what do you get out of this? She gave me a slow, knowing smile. Does it really matter? It did, because something told me Lena's motives weren't as simple as she was making them seem. I needed to be sure. I needed to know if this was just about Daniel and Julia, or if Lena had her own secrets buried in the wreckage she had created, and I was going to find out. My brother-in-law just told my wife he is in love with her. Part 10. Lena was lying. Maybe not entirely, maybe just in small ways. but I could feel it. She wanted me to believe this was all about Daniel and Julia, about a love story that never got its chance. But the way she spoke, the way she watched me like she was testing my reactions, there was something more, and I needed to know what it was. So instead of reacting, instead of giving her the satisfaction of seeing me angry, I leaned back against the counter and studied her. "You've always been good at finding people's weak spots, haven't you?" I said. Lena smirked. "I prefer to think of it as uncovering the truth." "No," I corrected. "You prefer to use the truth as a weapon. The question is, who are you really aiming at?" Something flickered across her face, just for a second. A crack in the mask. "Got you." The trap eye left Lena's apartment without giving her any more ground. I didn't demand answers. I didn't push. I let her believe I was still too caught up in my own misery to dig any deeper. But I was going to dig deeper, and I was going to start with Daniel. I knew he wouldn't tell me everything, not willingly. But if Lena had manipulated him into confessing, if she had played a role in whatever was happening now, I needed proof. So I made a call, not to Julia, not to Daniel, but to a private investigator. Watching the Watchers, the next morning, I met with James Cole, a man I'd worked with before on business-related investigations. He was sharp, discreet, and, most importantly, owed me a favor. "I need to know everything Lena's been up to," I told him. "Her calls, her meetings, anyone she's been in contact with. I want to know if she pushed Daniel into this, or if there's something else going on." Cole nodded. "You think she has an agenda?" "I know she does. And what about your brother?" I hesitated. "Daniel's emotional. If Lena has been feeding him the right kind of poison, he might not even realize he's being used." Cole gave me a knowing look. "You don't think Julia's in on this?" I exhaled. "I don't know. But I intend to find out." Julia's silence. That night, I finally went home. Julia was waiting for me in the living room, curled up on the couch, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. She looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept since our fight. "Ethan." Her voice was soft. "Where have you been?" "Thinking." She swallowed hard. She hesitated. "I need to talk to you." "Yeah," I said, sitting across from her. "I think you do." A long silence stretched between us. "Daniel told you, didn't he?" she asked quietly. "Yes." She closed her eyes for a moment as if bracing herself. "I didn't ask for this, Ethan. I didn't want to hurt you." "Then tell me the truth," I said, my voice tight. "Did you ever have feelings for him?" She flinched, just slightly, but I saw it. That was my answer. "I don't know," she whispered. "I never let myself think about it, because it didn't matter, because I chose you." "And now?" I asked, my heart pounding. She stared at me, her expression unreadable. "I don't know," she admitted. My hands clenched into fists. "Julia," I said, my voice low, "I love you. But if there's even a part of you that wants him, I need to know now." Her lips parted, but no words came. That silence told me everything, and for the first time I realized I might not be the one walking away from this marriage. My brother-in-law just told my wife he is in love with her. Part 11. The silence between Julia and me stretched on, thick and suffocating. My heart thudded in my chest as I waited for her to speak, to give me some kind of answer that could cut through the confusion, the tension, and the betrayal hanging in the air. But the longer she stayed silent, the more I understood. She didn't have an answer. That terrified me. "Julia," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "please, just tell me, do you want him, or do you want me?" Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't say a word. She couldn't. And in that moment, I realized that the silence was louder than anything she could have said. I had to make a choice. She might not know what she wanted, but I did. I couldn't live in this limbo forever. I need to know, Julia. I pressed, my voice raw with emotion. This isn't just about you and me anymore. It's about everything we've built, everything we've promised to each other. If you're still questioning things, I need to know now. Her lips trembled as she looked down, unable to meet my eyes. I don't know how to answer you, she whispered. I stood up abruptly, feeling the weight of my frustration and heartbreak settling over me like a suffocating blanket. I wanted to shout, to make her see that this indecision, this hesitation, was tearing me apart. But instead I just turned and walked out of the room. I needed air. I needed to think, and there was only one person who could help me clear my head, even if I hated myself for needing her now. The final confrontation. The next day, I walked back into Lena's apartment without knocking. She was sitting on the couch, reading a book, but when she saw me, she didn't flinch. She didn't even pretend to be surprised. "Back again?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "I need to know everything, Lena," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "Not just about Daniel. I need to know what you're playing at. What's your end game?" Lena smiled softly. "You still don't get it, do you?" she said, setting the book aside and standing up. "I'm not playing a game. I'm exposing one." I stepped closer. "What the hell does that mean?" "You and Julia," Lena said, her voice almost pitying. "You've been in a cage of your own making, a cage of lies, Ethan. The truth is, you never really had her. Not the way you thought you did. Not the way you wanted to." I felt my pulse quicken. "You think you're helping? By tearing everything apart?" Lena's eyes narrowed, and for a brief moment I saw something more than her usual coldness. A flicker of something genuine. Maybe regret. Maybe fear. "I'm trying to make you see the truth. Julia, she's lost, Ethan. She's been lost for a long time. She's never been yours completely. And you," she paused. "You've been too afraid to face that." The words hit me harder than I expected. The truth she was speaking, bitter, painful, and sharp, was more cutting than any of the games she'd played. "So what now?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "Do you want me to walk away? To let you have what you've always wanted?" Lena took a step forward, her gaze unwavering. "No," she said, quietly. "I want you to fight for what's yours." I froze. "What?" "Fight for your marriage, Ethan. For your wife, because if you don't, someone else will." The words hung in the air like a final warning. A challenge. For the first time in what felt like forever, I was no longer caught in the fog of indecision. Lena had forced me to face what I'd been, avoiding for too long. I wasn't going to let Daniel or anyone else take what was mine. It was time to fight. My brother-in-law just told my wife he is in love with her, Part 12. I stood there staring at Lena, the weight of her challenge sinking in. "Fight for what's yours," she had said. But what if I was already too late? What if Julia had already made her choice, quietly, in the silence of her hesitation? What if Daniel had already claimed a piece of her heart, and now it was just a matter of time before I lost her altogether? But Lena's words echoed in my mind. "Someone else will take what's yours." I couldn't let that happen. I had to make my move. The confrontation with Julia. Later that evening, after hours of pacing and contemplation, I walked back into the house. The front door creaked slightly as I pushed it open, the familiar scent of our home filling my lungs. But tonight, it felt alien. Julia was sitting at the kitchen table, her hands folded in front of her, her eyes empty. She hadn't looked up when I entered, and I knew then she was waiting for me to make the next move. I closed the distance between us, my heart pounding with a mixture of anger, fear, and desperation. "Julia," I said, my voice steady but intense. "We need to talk. For real this time." She looked up at me, her face pale. The tears were already welling in her eyes, and I knew she was about to break. "Ethan, I didn't mean for this to happen." "Then tell me, Julia, what did happen?" I demanded, my voice rising. "How did we get here? How did we end up at this point where my own brother is confessing his love for you?" She flinched at the words, her face crumpling with guilt. "I never meant to hurt you, Ethan. I swear. It's just—" She stopped, struggling for the right words. "It's just— with Daniel, there's always been something. Something I couldn't quite understand. Something that I've never been able to ignore." I felt my chest tighten. "So that's it? You've been holding on to this, whatever this is with Daniel, and now you don't even know if you still want me?" Julia stood up quickly, her hands trembling. "It's not like that. It's never been like that. You're my husband, Ethan. I love you." I swallowed hard, the words tasting bitter. "Then why couldn't you tell me that before? Why couldn't you stop this before it got this far?" She stepped closer, her voice breaking. "Because I didn't know how. I didn't know what to feel. And Daniel, he pushed me. He kept telling me things, making me question everything, making me think that maybe I had missed something all along." I shook my head. "Julia, you let him get this far. You didn't stop it. You didn't shut it down. And now I'm standing here wondering if you've been lying to me this whole time." She reached out, her hand trembling as she touched my arm. "I never wanted this, Ethan. I never wanted to hurt you, but I don't know how to make this right. I don't know what to do." The words I had been holding in for so long, the rage, the hurt, the fear, came flooding out. "Then tell me what you want, Julia," I yelled. "Tell me if you want me or if you want him. Tell me if I'm fighting for something that's already lost." She recoiled, her eyes wide with shock, but it wasn't the shock I expected. It wasn't fear or regret. It was confusion. And in that moment, I realized what Lena had been trying to make me see. Julia had never been fully mine. Not in the way I thought. Not in the way I wanted her to be. But I wasn't going to give up on her just yet. The final decision. Julia backed away, her eyes never leaving mine as she tried to gather herself. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. Instead, she sat back down at the table, her head buried in her hands. "Ethan, I don't know what to do." Her voice was barely a whisper. "I feel like I've lost myself, and I don't know if I can find my way back to us." I stood there, the pain in my chest almost unbearable. She wasn't the woman I thought she was anymore, and I wasn't sure if I was still the man she wanted. But I had to decide. I had to decide whether I would fight for her or whether I would walk away. And deep down, I knew. I wasn't ready to walk away. But this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about me, about us, and about what we had left to fight for. I took a deep breath and looked at her, my voice steady. "I'm not going to make any decisions tonight, Julia, but you need to. You need to figure out what you want, and then we'll talk. For real this time." She nodded slowly, her eyes filled with sadness. "I will." It wasn't a resolution. It wasn't a happy ending, but it was a step forward. My brother-in-law just told my wife he is in love with her. Part 13. The days that followed were a haze of silence and unspoken words. Julia and I coexisted in the same space, but weren't truly living in it together. She had agreed to think things through, but the emptiness between us stretched so wide that even the smallest gestures felt like a chasm. I gave her the time she needed, Maybe it was the only thing I could offer her now. But every day the question gnawed at me. Had she already made up her mind? But it wasn't just about waiting. I couldn't sit back and let this fester any longer. I needed answers. And there was one person, no, two, who had a piece of that answer. Lena and Daniel. And tonight, I was going to make sure they knew exactly where I stood. Confronting Daniel, I found Daniel at the bar we used to frequent, the one where everything felt so normal. Before all of this. Before the lies. Before the betrayal. He was sitting in a dark corner, a whiskey glass cradled in his hand as if it could somehow dull the chaos around him. When he saw me approach, he didn't flinch. He didn't look surprised. He already knew. You wanted to talk? I asked, my voice low but laced with a venom I didn't know I had inside me. Daniel sighed, placing the glass on the table before him. I knew you'd come. I just didn't know when. His gaze met mine, calm, almost too calm, as if everything we'd been through hadn't really fazed him. You're a sick bastard, Daniel, I spat. You've been lying to me, playing me, and now you think you can just confess your love for my wife and walk away from this unscathed? He didn't even flinch at the accusation. I don't know what you want from me, Ethan. I'm not going to apologize for feeling what I feel. I never meant to hurt you, but I'm not going to lie about it either. I love her. And maybe that's the truth you've been too afraid to see. I leaned in, my fists clenched, the air between us thick with animosity. If you think for a second that you're going to take her from me, you're wrong. She's my wife. And if you want to keep playing games with my life, you'll regret it. Daniel stared at me for a moment, then a faint smile curled at the corner of his lips. You don't get it, do you? This isn't a game to me, Ethan. This is real. But it's you who's been playing. Playing at being the perfect husband, playing at being the man she needs. You think that's enough? I could feel the anger boiling inside me, but I kept my voice steady. This ends tonight. I want you to stay away from Julia. No more confessions, no more games. If you don't, I'll make sure you regret it. He sat, back, his eyes dark and unfazed. You think you can threaten me? You think you can scare me? You've already lost her, Ethan. Whether you see it or not, it's over. I didn't speak again. I just turned and walked out, the door slamming behind me, the weight of Daniel's words sinking in deeper than I cared to admit. A confrontation with Lena, I didn't even go home right away. Instead, I headed straight to Lena's apartment, my mind spinning with everything that had just transpired. Lena wasn't surprised when I knocked on her door. She had been waiting for this moment. She always had a way of knowing when things were about to change. Come in, Ethan. Her voice was soft but firm, a subtle invitation. I stepped into her apartment, my eyes scanning the room as if I were seeing it for the first time. But it was Lena herself that commanded my attention. She sat on the couch, the same calculating look on her face, like she was always 5 steps ahead. What the hell is your game, Lena? I demanded, my voice sharp. You're not innocent in this. You've been stirring the pot from the very beginning. Lena didn't even blink. You're right. I've been involved, but only because you needed to face the truth. Your marriage was already broken, Ethan. You just didn't want to see it. I moved toward her, my anger flaring. So this was all part of your plan? To tear everything apart so you could play the savior? She didn't flinch, her gaze never leaving mine. No, Ethan. I didn't want to be the savior, but you needed to wake up. You've been blinded by your own pride and insecurity. You thought you were perfect for Julia, but you've been blind to the cracks in your relationship. All I did was give you a reason to see them. I could feel my fists balling, the frustration welling up in me. And what do you want from me now? To just let it go? To forget what Daniel did? To forget what you've done? Lena stood slowly, closing the distance between us with a cold smile. What I want, Ethan, is for you to make a choice. And I don't mean the obvious one. I mean the one that matters, the one that'll decide who you really are, what you'll fight for. I was done listening to her riddles. I don't know what your game is, but I'm done with you, Lena. I'm going to save my marriage. I'm going to fight for her, even if it means facing the truth that scares me. My brother-in-law just told my wife. He is in love with her. Part 14. The night felt heavy as I drove home. The darkness outside mirrored the turmoil inside me, and my thoughts were a whirlwind. Confronting Daniel had given me no answers, only more uncertainty. Lena had offered no relief, only a reminder of the cracks I had been blind to. I couldn't keep running from the truth, no matter how much it hurt. I needed Julia to make a choice, but I couldn't push her any harder. She needed space, and I needed to figure out if I could even trust her again. As I pulled into the driveway, the lights inside the house flickered on. Julia was waiting. I hesitated for a moment before stepping out of the car. I could feel the weight of the moment hanging over me, like a tightrope stretched across an abyss. There was no turning back. Confrontation at home. I walked into the house, the quiet of the night settling around us. Julia was standing by the window, her back to me, her posture rigid. I didn't say anything at first. Instead, I stood there, waiting for her to speak. The silence between us was suffocating. Finally, she turned to face me, her eyes red from the tears she'd clearly been holding back. "Ethan," she said, her voice hoarse, but there was something different in it, something more resigned. "I've been thinking." I nodded, unsure what she was about to say, but knowing it would be the moment of truth. "I never wanted any of this," she continued, stepping toward me slowly. "I never wanted to hurt you. But I've been lying to myself for a long time." She paused, wiping her eyes as if gathering strength. "Daniel, he was always there. I never meant to fall for him. I never meant for it to go this far, but I did." I took a deep breath, my heart pounding in my chest. "Julia, I need you to be honest with me. What are we doing? What is this? What do you want from me?" Her gaze dropped to the floor for a moment, as if she couldn't meet my eyes. "I don't know anymore, Ethan," she whispered. "I don't know if I can just forget what Daniel means to me, but I also don't know if I can walk away from everything we've built together." I swallowed hard, the weight of her words crushing me. The love, the trust, the years of our relationship, they didn't seem to matter now. They felt so distant, so fragile. And as much as I wanted to believe we could rebuild, I wasn't sure if she was capable of doing that with me. "So what happens now?" I asked quietly. "Do we keep pretending everything's fine, or do we face the reality of what's happened?" Julia closed her eyes as if she were bracing herself. I think we need space to figure out who we really are. If we can be who we were before. If I can even be the woman you need me to be." Her words were like a punch to the gut. I had hoped for clarity, for a sense of resolution. But it seemed like we were both drowning in uncertainty, neither one of us knowing which way to turn. "Space?" I repeated, trying to grasp onto something solid. "So that's it? We just stop? No fight? No hope?" Julia's expression softened, and she stepped closer to me, her hands trembling. "I don't want to lose you, Ethan, but I don't want to lose myself either. I need to figure out who I am and what I really want, and maybe you need to do the same." I wanted to pull her into my arms and promise her that everything would be okay. But I couldn't. She was right. Neither of us knew what we wanted anymore, and pretending otherwise would only drag us further into the mess we had created. The weight of the decision. The next few days were filled with silence, the kind of silence that could only exist between two people who no longer knew what to say to each other. I spent hours thinking, weighing the options. I had always prided myself on being someone who fought for what I wanted, But now, I wasn't sure what I wanted. Did I want to fight for a marriage that might already be lost? Did I want to keep fighting for a woman who couldn't even decide what she wanted? Or was it time to let go? But then there was the other question, one I had been avoiding. What about Daniel? Was I supposed to let him keep playing the role of the savior in Julia's life? Was I supposed to accept that she could fall in love with him? Or was I still fighting for a chance to make things right? I hadn't spoken to him since that night at the bar, but I knew that I had to face him again, to make it clear that no matter what Julia decided, I wasn't going to let him win without a fight, and this time, it wasn't just about Julia anymore. It was about me, about reclaiming my life, my dignity, and my marriage, or walking away if it was truly beyond saving. The final decision. The next evening, I called Daniel. He answered on the first ring, his voice dripping with the same casual indifference that had angered me before. "Ethan, we need to talk," I said, my voice steady. "I don't know what's going on with Julia, but I'm not going to let you play this game any longer. My brother-in-law just told my wife he is in love with her." Part 15. The following morning, as the sun slanted in through the blinds, I knew the time had come. I couldn't stand the limbo anymore. There had to be clarity. The decision had to be made, not by Julia alone, but by both of us, together. It was no longer about just me or just her. This was about our future, or the complete absence of one. I couldn't afford to keep hiding behind the walls of pride or fear. The only way forward was to confront everything, face to face. I decided it was time to put the pressure on Daniel, not just as a man, but as the one who had been inching into my life like a shadow, casting his presence where he had no right to be. It was time to take back control. I dialed the number for the last time. No more games. This was the moment where it ended, one way or another, confronting Daniel. Again, Daniel picked up, no surprise in his voice this time, but there was something different, something more tense. I could hear the background noise of his office, the hustle of a place that was his domain, his world, and for a moment I hated it. I hated how easily he seemed to slip into it. "Ethan," he said, his tone neutral but cold. "What is it now?" I stood by the door of our house, staring out the window. It felt like the weight of my entire life was pressing on my chest. "I'm coming to see you," I said, my voice unwavering. "We need to talk face to face. This ends today, Daniel. Either you stop messing with my marriage or I make you regret it." There was a long pause, a beat of silence that stretched between us. I could almost hear the gears turning in his mind. Finally, he spoke. "Fine. I'll be waiting." I hung up the phone and took a breath. It was time to end this once and for all. Final showdown, I drove to Daniel's office, my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter with every mile. The building loomed ahead like a fortress. It wasn't just about him anymore, it was about what he represented. The intrusion into my life, the violation of my marriage, the betrayal of a man I had called family. I wasn't about to let him walk away unscathed. When I stepped into the office, I saw him immediately. His casual demeanor was gone, replaced by something sharper, more calculating. He was sitting behind a large desk, looking at me as if he had anticipated this moment. "You want to end this," he said, his eyes flicking over me as if measuring my resolve. "But I don't think you know how. You're still holding on to something that doesn't belong to you anymore." I couldn't hold it in anymore. I slammed my fist onto the desk, startling him for a second. "You think this is some kind of game, don't you? You think you can just waltz into my life and take what's mine?" Daniel didn't flinch. He stood up slowly, his tall frame leaning toward me with that same air of control. "I didn't plan any of this, Ethan, but I'm not going to apologize for what I feel. You don't get to make the decisions here anymore." "I'm the one making decisions now," I retorted, my voice steady but full of venom. "And you're going to back off. This ends here." His gaze shifted, not in fear but in something else. Something like understanding but also resignation. "You're right, Ethan. It ends today, but not how you think." Before I could ask him what he meant, the door opened behind me with a soft creak. I didn't turn around, but the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. I didn't need to look to know who it was. Julia stepped into the room. Her face was pale, eyes wide with a mix of fear and regret. She had been listening. "Ethan," she began, her voice faltering as she looked between us. "I need to tell you something." The truth revealed. I turned to her, my chest tightening. The air in the room shifted. Whatever she had to say, I knew it would change everything. "What is it, Julia?" I asked, my voice low. She walked toward me slowly, her hands trembling slightly. She hesitated for a moment, and then her gaze met mine. Genuine pain and something else behind her eyes. "I never wanted it to go this far, but I've been torn between the two of you for weeks." Daniel remained silent, his presence like a dark cloud hanging over us. Julia took a deep breath before speaking again. "I love you, Ethan, but I also love him, and that's the truth. I've tried to deny it, to convince myself that what we had was enough, but I can't anymore. I owe you the truth, and I owe it to myself." The words felt like a knife cutting deep into me. I stood there in shock, trying to process everything she had just said. "So this was never just about me," I whispered, more to myself than to her. "It was about you and him all along." Julia's eyes filled with tears. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. I never meant to hurt you. But I've been lying to myself and to you for so long. I don't know how to fix it anymore." I looked from Julia to Daniel, and for a moment I saw them both as strangers. Their faces were etched with guilt. My brother-in-law just told my wife he is in love with her. Part 16. The drive home was a blur. The engine of my car hummed a steady rhythm, but my mind felt like a storm. Chaotic, disjointed, and too loud. Each turn, each flick of the signal, felt like a decision that was no longer just mine. I could still hear Julia's voice in my head, her confession echoing like a death knell to everything I thought I knew. "I love you, but I also love him." My hands gripped the wheel so tightly that my knuckles were white. How could she say that? How could she betray me in that way, with him of all people, my own brother-in-law? The man I trusted, the man I had once considered a friend. I pulled into the driveway, the familiar sight of our home suddenly feeling foreign, like I was walking into a stranger's life. The door creaked when I opened it, as if the house itself was waking from a long sleep, and I was the intruder. Inside, it was quiet. Too quiet. I could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, marking the passage of time that felt like it was moving too fast. I dropped my keys on the counter, my eyes scanning the room as if expecting some new revelation to jump out at me. But there was nothing. I went to the living room, slumping onto the couch, my head in my hands. This was it. The end of the road. The end of everything I thought I could trust, but I couldn't keep living like this. Not anymore. A moment of clarity. For the first time in days, I found myself alone, without distractions. No phone calls, no constant barrage of thoughts running through my mind. It was just me, sitting in the stillness of my own home, allowing the truth to settle. I thought about Julia, the woman I married, the one I loved. But I thought about Daniel, too. His confidence, his charm, the way he always knew how to make her smile. I couldn't deny it anymore. There had been something brewing between them for longer than I wanted to admit, and I wasn't sure I could ever look at either of them the same way again. But as I sat there trying to make sense of the mess, something else emerged, something I hadn't expected. I realized I couldn't just walk away. Not like this. I couldn't let my entire life crumble without understanding why it all happened. There were answers out there, answers that would make or break this final chapter. I needed to confront Julia. I needed closure, no matter what it cost. The confrontation. That night, Julia came home later than usual, her footsteps hesitant as she entered the house. I was waiting for her, sitting at the dining table, my gaze unwavering. She froze in the doorway, caught off guard by my silent presence. She must have thought she would be met with something different. Maybe anger, maybe silence, maybe anything, but the calm that had overtaken me. "Ethan?" she asked, her voice soft, uncertain. "We need to talk," I said, not moving from my spot. The words hung in the air like a declaration. Julia took a step forward, her eyes flickering between the door and me. She closed it behind her with a soft click, then slowly walked over and sat down across from me. "I know you're angry," she said quietly. "I never wanted to hurt you, Ethan. I thought I could keep it all in—" "Stop," I interrupted, my voice calm but firm. "I don't need you to apologize right now. I need you to tell me the truth. Not just about you and Daniel, but about us, about everything. I need to understand why this happened." She hesitated, her gaze falling to the table. Her fingers traced the edge of her wine glass, as if trying to find something to hold on to. "I don't know how it happened," she whispered. "I've been living in this house, in this marriage, and I thought I was happy. But then, Daniel—" Her voice trailed off. "Don't give me that," I said, the frustration seeping through. "You were happy with me, Julia. You were content, and then he came along, and everything changed. You've been lying to me for months." Her eyes flickered to mine, a spark of guilt and sadness reflecting in them. "It wasn't like that. It wasn't just about him. It's about me, too. About how I felt. How lost I felt in this marriage. I was trying to hold it together, but I was falling apart." I leaned back in my chair, feeling like the ground beneath me was shifting. The truth was slipping out, but I didn't know if it was enough to fix what had been broken. "So, what now?" I asked. "You love him, Julia. You're in love with Daniel. You said it yourself." She looked down, unable to meet my eyes. "I don't know what I feel anymore, Ethan. But I know I've hurt. You and I never wanted that. I thought I could fix it, fix me, before it got to this point." I stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor as I pushed it back. "You've already hurt me, Julia. And now, we're standing at the edge of something neither of us can take back. You have to choose. You have to choose between me and him. Not tomorrow, not next week. Right now." There was silence between us for what felt like an eternity. My brother-in-law just told my wife he is in love with her. Part 17. The days that followed felt like a blur, a constant whirlwind of emotions that didn't allow me to catch my breath. Julia and I barely spoke, the tension between us thick enough to cut with a knife. Every glance felt like a calculation. Every word spoken felt like it carried a weight we couldn't bear. She was torn, her feelings for Daniel apparent, but the remnants of our life together, what we once shared, still lingered in her eyes. I spent hours pacing the house, trying to make sense of everything. I questioned my every move, every word, every decision that had led to this point. And in those hours, I realized something. I wasn't just angry at Julia. I wasn't just betrayed by her love for Daniel. I was betrayed by the years I had spent blind to the cracks in our marriage. It was easy to point the finger at her, to blame her for the affair. But what about me? Had I been so consumed with my own life, my own ambitions, that I neglected the woman I vowed to cherish? Had I truly been present, or had I simply existed alongside her in a comfortable silence that allowed both of us to drift further apart? The visit I found myself standing in front of Daniel's apartment door a few days later, unsure of why I had come. Was I there to confront him? To demand answers? Or was I simply searching for some sort of closure that neither Julia nor I could provide? Before I could knock, the door swung open, revealing Daniel standing in the doorway, his face a mix of surprise and wariness. "Ethan," he said, his voice low. "What are you doing here?" I swallowed hard, the anger that had been simmering inside, me now boiling over. But there was something else, too, something unexpected, a sense of resignation. Maybe I was done with the shouting, done with the blaming. What was the point? This was bigger than a betrayal between brothers. This was about everything that had gone wrong, all the years that had been wasted. "I need to talk," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. "I need to understand why." Daniel stepped aside, motioning for me to come in. As I entered his apartment, the weight of the situation pressed down on me harder than I expected. I had never been in this space before. This was his domain, his life outside of the life I thought I knew. The room was minimalist, sparse in a way that made it feel cold. There were no photos of family, no personal mementos, just a few scattered books and a large window that overlooked the city. It felt clinical, detached from everything I had imagined. "Sit," Daniel said, gesturing to a nearby chair. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey before sitting down across from me. I didn't touch the glass. I didn't need the distraction. "You want answers?" he asked, his voice almost too calm. "I'm not sure I have them, Ethan. But I'll give you what I can." I leaned forward, my gaze never leaving his. "Why? Why her? Why now?" Daniel took a slow sip from his glass, his eyes scanning the room before he met mine. "Because I never stopped loving her," he said, his voice quieter now, as if the weight of his confession was finally hitting him. "I always loved her, even when I knew it was wrong, even when I saw you two together, but I never acted on it, not until it became clear that there were cracks in your marriage." The words stung, but there was something about his honesty, something raw about the way he laid it out there, that made me feel less angry and more confused. Was this some twisted sense of redemption? Was this his way of explaining his actions, or was it just the truth spilling out? "You've always been there for her," I said, my voice thick with the weight of my emotions. "But you never told me, Daniel. You never once told me how you felt. You were my brother. You were supposed to be on my side." He nodded slowly, his gaze lowering. "I know. I was selfish. I should have never let it get this far." There was a long silence between us, the tension so thick that it felt like we were both suffocating in it. But it was the silence I needed. The answers I'd been searching for, at least part of them, were there, in front of me. I could see it now. The depth of his feelings, the complexity of the situation. He wasn't the villain I had painted him to be. And maybe I wasn't either. We were both just lost. The decision. That evening, after leaving Daniel's apartment, I went home, unsure of what I would find. Julia was waiting for me, sitting at the kitchen table with her hands clasped in front of her, her eyes red from crying. She hadn't been sleeping well, I could tell. I didn't sit down. I stood by the door, watching her as she waited for me to speak, her expression a mixture of fear and anticipation. "I talked to Daniel," I said, my voice steady. "I have answers, but I'm not sure they're the answers I wanted." Her eyes widened. "What did he say?" "He said he always loved you, that he never stopped, and that he was waiting for the right moment. My brother-in-law just told my wife he is in love with her, Part 18. The days following my conversation with Julia felt like an endless limbo. The house was quieter than it had ever been, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. Julia and I exchanged only brief, cautious words, each of us retreating into our own corners, neither one of us willing to make the first move toward healing or breaking. I spent my days in a fog, moving through routines, without really experiencing them. I worked, I ate, I slept, but all of it felt distant, disconnected from the life I had known. It wasn't until I started reaching out to old friends, people who had known me before this storm hit, that I realized how much I had let myself drift. I wasn't just searching for answers anymore. I was searching for myself, trying to find a path that would lead me back to who I was before all this madness took root. But it wasn't just the past I was dealing with. It was the future, the uncertain, fragile future that had been torn open by betrayal, by secrets, by choices. The question was no longer about whether Julia or Daniel could fix things. It was whether I could fix myself. The unexpected visitor, one rainy evening, when the sky had turned a dull gray and the streets outside were slick with water, there was a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, but I answered it anyway, hoping that it wasn't some lingering reminder of the past I wasn't ready to face. To my surprise, it was Elliot Vance, the man who had disappeared from our lives years ago, the same one who had once been a corporate fixer with ties to people I'd rather forget. He stood there, drenched from the rain, his coat soaked through, his face inscrutable. I barely recognized him. The man in front of me wasn't the suave, confident figure I remembered from our past. This man looked broken. "Ethan," Elliot said softly, his voice more weary than I had ever heard it. "I need to talk to you." I didn't invite him in. Instead, I leaned against the door, wary but curious. "What do you want, Elliot?" I asked, my voice sharp. "You've been out of the picture for a long time. What could you possibly have to say to me now?" He glanced behind him as if making sure no one was watching, then stepped closer. His eyes were filled with something, regret, fear, guilt, but there was also an intensity there that made me hesitate. "This isn't about your brother-in-law," he began, his voice tight. "This is about Julia, and it's about something bigger than any of you realize." I frowned. "What do you mean?" Elliot took a deep breath, clearly struggling with whatever he was about to reveal. "I don't expect you to understand, but there's more to Julia's actions than you think. More than what you've been told." The words hung in the air, heavy and pregnant with the kind of tension that made my gut tighten. "What are you talking about?" I demanded, a sense of unease creeping up my spine. Elliot stepped back, lowering his voice. "It's not just about love, it's about power and control. Julia's involvement with your brother-in-law, it wasn't accidental. There's a reason it all happened the way it did, and you're in the middle of something far bigger than a simple affair." I blinked, trying to process his words, but they didn't make sense. Nothing made sense anymore. "You're telling me that this is all some kind of game?" I asked incredulously. Elliot nodded. "Something like that. And the truth, Ethan, the truth is going to break you." I didn't know what to say to that. The air between us felt thick with something I didn't want to acknowledge. Elliot Vance, the man who had orchestrated countless deals, manipulated situations for his own gain, was now warning me of something even darker, something beyond my comprehension. But before I could ask any more questions, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the night as quickly as he had appeared. The revelation the following. Days were a blur of confusion and mounting tension. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something crucial that would make all of this, the betrayal, the affair, the secrecy, make sense. I kept thinking about Elliot's warning, his cryptic words about Julia being caught in something far bigger than her emotions. I couldn't help but wonder what he knew, what I was too blind to see. And then one afternoon, as I was going through some old files, I found it, the missing piece. It was a letter addressed to Julia from an anonymous source. It was dated a few months before everything started to unravel, before she confessed her feelings for Daniel. The letter was short, but its implications were far-reaching. It mentioned financial ties, secret meetings, and a network of influence far beyond anything I had imagined. It wasn't just a personal betrayal. Julia had been involved in something dangerous, something that had put her, and me, at the center of a scheme I could never have predicted. The choice. I called Julia that evening, my voice barely masking the storm of emotions that raged inside me. She came home later than usual, her expression distant, her eyes betraying nothing of what was going through her mind. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Julia," I said, the letter clenched tightly in my hand. "We need to talk." She looked at me, her lips trembling slightly. "What's wrong?" "What's wrong is that I just found something," I said, my voice shaking with the weight of what I was about to say. "Something that explains everything. Your involvement with Daniel, your secrecy. It wasn't just about love, was it? There's something else going on. Something that you've been hiding from me." Her face drained of color as I held the letter up, the truth finally dawning on her. "You don't understand," she whispered, her eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and fear. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. I never wanted you to be caught in the middle." "Then explain it to me," I demanded, "because I'm done living in the dark, Julia. I'm done pretending that this is just a mistake, that you were just lost. I need the truth, and I need it now." For a moment, Julia said nothing. She simply stood there, her hands shaking. And in that silence, I realized something. Whatever came next, whatever truth she was about to reveal, it would change everything. Again.